two tragic events involving mothers killing their young children have now sparked conversations around support for those dealing with mental illness. Yesterday, South African mother Lauren Dickason was convicted in New Zealand for the murder of her three daughters, while here at home, Bongeka Buso took her own life after killing her three children. Let's bring into the conversation Professor Simone Honikman, who is the director of the Perinatal Mental Health Project at the University of Cape Town. And I want to just preface our interview, Prof. Good morning, it's great to see you, by saying that this is not commentary on your part on the cases involved in my introduction, but it is an opportunity for us, right, to have this kind of conversation around the impact of postpartum depression on mothers and on families.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here. Very sad times indeed, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Prof, let's begin at the very basics. What is postpartum depression?
Postpartum depression is depression within the first 12 months after a baby is born, and it's experienced by mothers and fathers, much more often by mothers. It seems to be more common in mothers, and in South Africa it looks about 1 in 5, 1 in 3 women in that period, in the 12 months after the birth of their babies, will experience depression. The features of depression at this time are the same as the features of depression in any person at any time of their lives. We use the same diagnostic criteria, but of course, because there are the demands of child rearing, the issues around breastfeeding and sleep deprivation and economic stress, and the particular stresses around this period, which are huge for many women, make it a particularly vulnerable period for women at this time. And I think it's also important to realize that for many women, that depression has occurred during pregnancy. So we actually prefer the term perinatal depression because for many women, there are either early signs or there are actually full features of depression in that pregnancy period. So the term perinatal really refers to the whole time pregnancy, that antenatal period, as well as that year postpartum.
That segues well into my next question because, one would ask the question, why do some women and some fathers suffer from postpartum depression when others do not? Am I more susceptible to perinatal depression if I've suffered from depression even earlier on in life, before having children?
Okay, great. So we do have some pretty well-established risk factors. And you've mentioned one quite strong risk factor is a previous experience of mental health issues yourself. So if you have a background of any kind of mental health challenge, the stress of becoming pregnant or having a child or having to look after a young child often makes people more vulnerable and can trigger another episode or an episode of depression. So there are a range of risk factors that we know about in addition to past mental health challenges. They include being a teenager, being exposed to violence, domestic violence, gender-based violence, or past childhood traumatic experiences. Those are very, very strong risk factors. Poverty and food insecurity. We've established, especially now, there's been some interesting work around COVID and what's happened with food insecurity. But we ourselves did some research in Hanover Park and looking at food insecurity even prior to the pandemic. And food insecurity is a very places an enormous strain on people, especially at this time. Social isolation, lack of a supportive, loving partner or community or family, being displaced, being a refugee, or being a person who's moved from an ordinary community of support into a place of relative isolation. These are a range of risk factors. Having hostile in-laws, interestingly, is one. Having a past history of using substances. All of these place people at risk But I think what's important to realize is that these are risk factors. They're not inevitable.
Yeah.
So just if somebody is an adolescent and they have HIV, chronic illnesses, is also a risk factor, doesn't necessarily mean that they will experience these mental health problems in the perinatal period. It just means that there's a higher chance. And there's a lot we can do to buffer that in people who have risks. There's a lot we can do to prevent people becoming unwell. And it's really our responsibility to kind of identify these vulnerable groups and provide them with adequate care to keep them as well as possible at this critical time.
Yeah. I mean, do you think, Prof, that this is an issue that doctors in caring for pregnant mothers are keeping a close enough eye on? Are questions being asked in those consultations, not just scanning the baby and getting your 3-6 month scan and so on, but also checking in with the mother and saying, looking at your history, these are the triggers you need to look out for. Are you experiencing any of these stresses and so on?
Yeah, I don't want to point fingers at doctors per se, because I think the health system is responsible, and the health system hasn't really come up to the challenge by any stretch of the imagination. I think there are a lot of people who interface with families and women during pregnancy and postpartum. They're coming into contact with a range of professionals in the social development sector, social workers, health workers, nurses, midwives, doctors. And I think there's this kind of lack of appreciation that this period of time is not just about the physical. So absolutely, you're right. There is a reluctance. There's a kind of institutional stigma in the health sector. There's a kind of avoidance. Mental health is not my business. There's an issue of lack of confidence. How do I do it? How do I ask the questions? What happens if somebody does have a mental health problem? Am I trained enough? Where can I refer a person? Is it going to open up a can of worms? So we're not coming to the party yet, although we are increasingly moving closer and closer towards our goal. There's been great progress in the last 10, 15 years, certainly within the public health sector. There's new policy, we're writing new guidelines, there's a new screening tool in the maternity case record, which is the handheld stationery. We need to develop the system an entire system in order to accommodate integrating mental health as a routine part of maternity care. We cannot afford to separate out mental health and physical health at this time. If 1 in 3 or 1 in 5 women are experiencing a mental health problem, and often it's not just depression, sometimes it's anxiety as well, and often the two go together. If we have this burden of disease, if we have this burden that women are carrying, it is negligent to ignore it. We have to address it if we're wanting to support women and we're wanting to support the next generation.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the issue of stigma, because I imagine that is a huge challenge insofar as seeking out help is concerned. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there are these mothers who are just able to do it all, right? We live in an era of social media. There are these mothers who are giving us a really skewed picture of what motherhood looks like. You know, no one wakes up fully made up with babies that are dressed and ready to go. So in the context of all of that and all of the pressure that there is to live up to these impossible standards of motherhood, how do we encourage women to come forward and ask for the help that they need?
I mean, I certainly agree there is this kind of idealization of motherhood in the media, in the stories that families and communities tell. So I think it's not just the media that reinforce this idea of what is a good mother and being a good mother. I think it's reassuring that I think there's a shift there, and I think people are learning to become more honest in the last 5-10 years. And I think especially with COVID again, people are starting to feel more comfortable about speaking to speak about mental health issues in themselves and in their families. So I'm hoping that the kind of rosy tinted issue around motherhood is being challenged in social media and in general conversations. I think there is a shift. I think that problem, though, really reflects something that a sector of the population is struggling with. I think the vast majority of the population are not necessarily concerned with aspirations of perfection, but are probably concerned with day-to-day survival.
Yeah.
And when you're in survival mode and you're worrying about the next meal and whether you're going to be beaten up or whether there are going to be bullets flying outside your window or whether you've got a job next week, it's these kinds of stresses that puts the whole idea of kind of, well, I've got a mental health issue into a lower category of consideration.
Puts it on the back burner.
So people don't. It's not a priority for people. But I really think I think that stigma is also, as I mentioned, institutional. And by that I mean it's not necessarily to blame the public who don't know and don't come forward about mental health issues. There's certainly that problem. But I think as institutions, as health workers, as social development workers, as government, if we don't address this huge burden on our population, we are ignorant and we are culpable of stigma within our institutions.
And exactly what you're talking about, it's specific to the South African context because economically we are so incredibly skewed in this country.
Exactly. The disparities and the inequity between the have and the have-not are enormous. And I think, our prevalence, if you compare how common these problems are in South Africa compared to wealthy countries or countries which have a more stable system, those rates are probably about half of ours. And that's not to say that women who are wealthy or have support won't experience mental health issues. It just means that they have a lower risk. So, certainly women who are who live in relative socioeconomic comfort may still experience childhood trauma and domestic violence, and they may still be at risk. But they're often either buffering effects, or they're just less likely to do it than a woman who's living on her own with 3 kids in a township with crude insecurity.
Professor Simone Honikman, let me thank you for those insights this morning. It's such an incredibly important conversation. Prof. Honikman is the director of the Perinatal Mental Health Project at UCT.